Welcome to Rune Soup, a weekly podcast about magic, culture, and the paranormal. My name is Gordon, and I shall be your host. This week, I want to try something a little bit different. I want to talk about talking. Now, I actually did have and do indeed have an episode in the can to talk about talking, and it is with Alex Securis of Skeptico. And we recorded it in early June, and I suppose a number of things have changed since then. In fact, I spent all yesterday with Alex here in San Diego when we went looking at petroglyphs and had lunch, on a cliff looking at the ocean, and had a really, really good day. And we spoke about some of the things that we had recorded for that show, and I guess I was more dismayed about talking about discourse then than I am currently right now. And there are sort of a couple of key reasons for that. And I suppose, the principal one was last week we had Chaotic Good was on in Los Angeles. So, granted, the venue wasn't the Hollywood Bowl, but it sold out and it was really well received, and it was absolutely amazing to hear people and hear their stories and chat to them afterwards and all that kind of thing. And I was kind of thinking about it beforehand because in some respects, having the event in LA is a good test for where the discourse is at, because California is, I'm sure we'd all agree, home to woke imperialism. And I wasn't really sure, given the intensity of the topics that Connor and I spoke about, I wasn't really sure how that was going to resonate. You never know how many Bernie bro types or what have you have in the audience there. But that wasn't the case at all. The general point, and I think it was well received from the event, is the underlying narratives with which we construct our world are falsified. And the two key ones for us in the West is, of course, materialism, and the other one being neoliberalism. So beforehand, I wasn't sure whether there is, whether people are really willing to look at that, particularly the neoliberalism, where all of a sudden, you see on Twitter that people are, for the first time ever, suddenly concerned about drone strikes because they don't like the particular president, even though it's a continuation of disastrous and genocidal Middle East policy that's been, running for several decades now. But that was all, and I guess the point that we tried to get across is because these underlying assumptions are falsified, you could almost say literally any other axioms in which you kind of use to have reality unfold are better. And in particular, the ones that, for the context of this talk, we bracketed under the description of the occult. And the occult means a bunch of different things. I made sure to sort of separate out the difference between magic, which I consider older, and the occult, which is that sort of, thanks to Agrippa, Renaissance conceptualization of what is essentially a hidden wisdom or hidden belief system, because, occult means hidden, and so on. And it was really good to see that the liberalism that I feared would be evident certainly wasn't in play that evening, and that was good. If I think about it, sure, we had a bit over 100 people there in a city of whatever it is, 10 million. So I'm sure it's still prevalent. But I wanted to talk about talking with Alex because at some stage, and this was sort of my point, it was a serious question to him when we recorded in early June. What is the point? If you don't end up, and this is just psychologically true, people don't have their minds changed by argument. You can't yell people into agreeing with you. Doing a weekly podcast is a lot of work. I adore it. I adore the conversation components. The rest of it is very frustrating. But you get to a few moments or a few points where you go, well, at what stage are we preaching to the choir rather than changing people's minds, and do you even need to? And it was just generally a low point, right? But the event made me realize, and chatting to people, that there are a lot of us out there that are already operating on better metaphysics. So, for instance, one of the things, clearly, we talk about power politics and all that kind of stuff as it came up, and Connor made a very good point about, I suppose you could call it meta-conspiracy. So, whatever percentage of the Pizzagate story is correct, and it might be 0%, it might be 1%, or so on, it kind of comes back to the drone question. When did you all start caring about the fate of children in a Western system, given that you have military contractors, sex slave trading them, and we bomb your many weddings and so on, but all of a sudden we're outraged at whatever the Pizzagate thing is, right? And in that sense, there's a kind of point to being interested in parapolitics, which is to have a wider frame around it rather than looking for the answer. It's almost a via negativa, or negative road approach, where you can make sure that you don't fall into the traps, rather than, I don't know, Sudoku puzzle solve what's actually going on and then march on Washington, because that's not going to do anything. That generally never does anything. And I think that was quite well received. I think people now have an awareness, with people we would consider magically operant or magically adjacent, have that awareness that that's, I guess, the correct way of looking at it. It's with that deep suspicion of all power structures. And I could see some of that. It was really fun talking to people who, I spoke to a couple of fund managers and people who have an economics background after the event. And some of the techniques and modes of thinking that were described in Chaos Protocols are being used for funding allocation for nonprofits associated with the homeless in Los Angeles. Like talking to premium members at the drinks, it's amazing to see how many people are in the kind of ruins of the dominant meta-narratives, are building something much more interesting and individualized and unique. And it was just really kind of splendid to see that happen, because I don't know how much further out one can see. It's a question of sort of spying trajectories rather than getting a detailed map of the terrain. And one of the questions from the audience enabled me to talk about how we conceptualize that. And if you recall the podcast episode, and if you haven't listened to it, go back and listen to it, with Jack Hunter last year, to do with Charles Fort, and how he conceptualized the sort of changing modes of Western thinking, and he called them dominants. And he perceived, even in the early 20th century, that we were moving out of the dominant of science and into the dominant of witchcraft. And I kind of think that's happening all around us. If I look at people's lives who share parts of them with me, or come out to Los Angeles to hear some podcaster talk, there is no wider structure. There is no kind of like meta component to it beyond this integration of personal psi experience and a deep cynicism of economic and political structures, in a positive sense, in the sense of being able to build one's own and construct one's own map. And it's the classic story. This is the general mystic journey. But for me, it was quite rewarding, and that's why I'm just going to be talking to myself rather than chatting to Alex. For me, it was quite rewarding to see that people are actually doing that, because you can talk it all you want. And I guess that's a wider comment on the availability, no matter what your situation, and the availability of unique ways and access to opportunities and so on. There's a couple of bizarre moments obviously there's been a lot of events and drinking and such. So I've taken a few Ubers in the last week and a half, and particularly now that I'm in San Diego, the drivers we've had the most fascinating discussions, because I'm sure some of you may have read my previous articles. I have a deep dislike of Uber as a company, and I think they're attempting to turn the corner by getting rid of their horrible CEO and so on. And I definitely don't use them in London because I think black cabs are something of a cultural miracle. But, we use them here. And everyone I've spoken to has been in one way or another remarkable. And remarkable even though the situation is what it is. And we talk about that, which is it's not that great a job, picking up tourists at 1:30 in the morning from Mission Beach and taking them back to an Airbnb. But one guy was doing his master's in aeronautical engineering and was applying to the University of Southampton in the UK. The next one was an economics student who was also an Olympic weightlifting trainer and probable Olympic weightlifting contestant in the 2020 Olympics. And you think, this is, if you look at it as both the positive and the negative, this is quite a good sign. I know Americans work longer hours than anyone else in the Western world and so on. So you can look at the solely negative side, which is, you dealing with a kind of two-job student situation. And that was my situation as a student in Australia as well. So it's not it's a perspective for which I have tremendous sympathy because it's difficult. But it's also remarkable. And whilst neither of these people, as far as I could tell, were particularly interested in magic, it was good to see that if you sort of step sideways or think sideways, there are modes of being that are available, and that was the general point of the event, to kind of demonstrate that your own thinking can have reality unfold in such a remarkably different and better way. And more than that, I guess, because in some sense I knew these people were out there. I knew some of the premium members, at least by email address, before they all came out, and same thing with podcast listeners and so on. But as you'll recall, for the last couple of years at least, I've been talking about analog networks of people as we move into, we're in a world of total surveillance and unreliable access to corporate-controlled platforms that you literally have no right to use. If Twitter doesn't want you to use Twitter, you can't use it. It's not yours. It's not a public service. It's not a public utility. It is a corporate-owned technology stack. Same thing with Facebook. Same thing when people get upset because YouTube videos have been demonetized and so on. I'd been talking about this for years, and it's starting to happen. And realistically, the only way forward is analog networks. And that doesn't mean, although this would be awesome, that doesn't mean you write letters to each other or little postcards or something. It means that it's an analogous human-to-human network. So the shape of the conversation is an organic one between a human and a human and a human and a human. And that was what I think, talking to these people with disparate life waves at the event, and that was the thing that really stuck with me, I guess, that the analog network is in play. Some people, which I think is lovely, don't use Facebook. Other people, well, one person grumbled the only reason they use Twitter is so that they can @message me, which apologies for that. It's just the least worst option available. And if you think about the particular constellations of persons they know in real life, digital footprints, their connections, and so on, you have a network that can't be de-indexed or demonetized. You have a way, and it's not a looking backwards way. This is the crucial point. It's not something really dumb like neo-primitivism, where we all just like hang out in a tribe and burn down cell phone towers and all that. It's not that. It's what happens. If the word cyborg didn't annoy me so much, that would be the word I would use for it. It's a cyborg world where it is this individualized mix of communications technology and organics. And it was really amazing to see that come through at capacity. If you look at the event, Chaotic Good, essentially, it was an Eventbrite page and a dance studio behind a cafe. And you think about how that reached the people it did, so that it got to capacity. And you know that these things that were out there, that these things are possible. And it was, for me, really nice to see that, you know, they're real. You people are all real. And it's not just some kind of digital echo. And that's kind of what Alex and I spoke about over lunch yesterday, and why maybe rather than sharing that recording, instead I would talk about why I don't think my perspective in that recording is in play. And he agreed. He says he's not sure if that's particularly valuable, given that, you know, my opinion has been changed by meeting all these amazing others that are out there, and kind of having that connection, and also seeing that the feedback from the event. So people got a lot out of it. People had the same experience I did, which is, it's amazing to see that the others are real, that they can, if you go and find them, they are in fact there. And it's been an interesting couple of weeks, because it's been a mix of having lots and lots of people around me, and now, other than presumably the helicopters you can hear above Pacific Beach right now, moments of being alone. So it's either there's 100 people in the room or on my own, and it's been a kind of, Swedish sauna therapy of being around humans and not. And it's given me time to think about talking and how we talk about talking, and what its short and medium-term value are. So one of the, and I think there's a lot to be said for it, is more or less the conclusion. I mean, some of the questions towards the end, when we did the Q&A, brought up that everyone's kind of in the same metaphysical pain point. So there was a question from a psychologist asking about what kind of physical or observable effects there are for psi phenomena which have implications for mind-body divide. So she was actually asking, are we at the end of the usefulness of a science of mind-body, given that psi phenomena are real? And obviously the answer to that is yes. If you are a premium member, you'll know we've been kind of wandering through the woods of a better metaphysics, which I'm calling big table animism. And the example, of course, I gave was Dr. Darrell Bem's research that precognitive abilities improve if sexual imagery is involved. So he would have images that are either pornographic or not behind a curtain, and you would find physical responses like electrochemical changes and sort of skin changes in advance of seeing the sexually arousing imagery. So there's a body precognitive match there. And what I guess is good about having those discussions, and this is my takeaway in the talking about talking, is I learned something. Hopefully I answered the question in a way that would allow the questioner to go and find out more. And all of this stuff is done in a way that isn't just yelling at people on the internet. And also is in a way that is answer-splaining. I was going to say mansplaining, but it wasn't just males involved. In a way that doesn't presume that that the answers are available. So, I mean, that was one of them. There were other quite deep stuff that went on. So, inevitably, we spoke about the role of the right or the alt-right in the occult, because at the moment, again, if you look at the internet, that appears to be a kind of like dominant political position within the occult. And I just, I don't think it is. One, you can kind of, I don't think what the alt-right is doing qualifies as magic as I understand it, but there is certainly a right leaning to magic that the point we landed on was it's essentially the left's fault. What people we would presumably making the assumption you were left leaning and listening to this, people we would consider allies don't think it's real. It's that kind of the positivism and materialism that is inherent in a kind of Marxist analysis means that we have completely ceded the field of magic to the right, and it seems to me the only solve for that is to occupy it ourselves, is to reoccupy it, and not necessarily shout them down, but make sure there are at least some of us there as well. And I guess I use the example that I mentioned in Pieces of Eight, which I still find it would be funny if it wasn't so awful, but St. George, being the patron saint of England, is also the patron saint of some far-right groups like the English Defence League. And it's still, as I said, it amuses me if it wasn't so awful that a kind of Keep England White movement uses a dead Assyrian as its patron saint. And that's a good example, because it's not clear to me. I don't think you can step away just because you have some like odious ideologies in it, because it's not clear to me that there is a connection between an interest in Cumbrian ghost stories and the racial hiring politics or policies of a large American corporation. They're all things to be grappled with. But if you leave Cumbrian ghost stories alone because people who aren't politically aligned with you, I just feel like we're missing. And I don't know how we're supposed to do it. It's another one of those I don't know, but here's the situation. The left has fundamentally failed to acknowledge psi phenomena and live with better axioms underneath it. And as a result, it's been colonized by the right, because it's very easy to mutate the idea of a sacred self or individuality, which are all important. And frankly, in that Grant Morrison sense, there is only ever one revolution. Frankly, the main front line of the battle is the kind of edge of your being, right? So those things are all true. And it's very easy to mutate them into a hyper-individualistic, Atlas Shrugged kind of world. So you can, but because that mutation's there doesn't mean we shouldn't be exploring the other components that are neither left nor right. They just appear to be the terrain of magic and thinking about it. So it was interesting. And the example I used, because I had to think about that, we opened, Connor sort of gave a what of the occult, and I gave a why. And my why was to sort of tell a little bit of the story of Agrippa, which we've chatted about on this podcast before. And if you've listened to the Grimoire course, you'll sort of know I have an uneasy relationship with De Occulta Philosophia, with his book, 3 Books of Occult Philosophy, because he kind of exemplifies why the occult is important now, even though the book came out in 1651. I mean, he wrote this book when he was young, as you know, and it was throughout his life he did things like stand up against anti-Semitism and was an early proponent of what you might consider women's rights or the correct treatment of mental health, because of his positions around things like the witch trials. And this was associated with a guy who also bundled together what he believed wrongly, but nevertheless believed was he attempted to cohere a survival of sort of lost wisdom from, an earlier, higher, more elevated age from before the flood. So his, and that tension between, broadly, that's 17th century activism, we might as well call it that, and an interest in magic or the occult, and then an attempt to cohere them. And it's even though the sort of his picture of history and his kind of breathless appropriation of Arab astrology and kind of poorly appropriated Hebrew Kabbalah and so on is now, you look at it and go, this is it's a bit of a mess. It's not really where it's at now. It's to miss the point. It's to miss the point of him going in over the course of seeking, at least the early parts of his life, better ways of being in the world leads to thinking about other people in a more inclusive and more equitable or more human way. And for me, I guess that's an interesting part of his journey. The last part, and this gets a bit metaphysical in a different way, is he more or less repudiated the occult towards the end of his life. Like his earlier stuff, he considered, a soul-risking folly of youth, and I sort of wonder about that. Occultism or magic as a metaphysics rather than a practice is useful until it isn't. It reorders the world, and once it's reordered, I mean, by the end of his life, he taught royalty and he was in a debtor's prison and all this. So he kind of had there's a weird Crowley match there, right? Because by the end of Crowley's life, he wasn't doing that much magic, but there are a few people who did as much as he did, and there's an almost it's almost like putting more bandages on once the wound has healed. You think, well, I don't need the bandages anymore. Now, I'm not saying occultism is something you grow out of, but there's a peculiar shape to this book and the long shadows that De Occulta Philosophia has cast, for better and worse, down through kind of Western esotericism, that gives you some food for thought for today, which is how do you engage with the return of old ideas in a better way. So, obviously Grimoire revival, increasing access to PGM and PGM era texts and so on. How do you do that in a way that isn't immediately conservative, which is from a political perspective, which is to say that the past is better than the present and the future? Because that's not inherent in magic. That wasn't inherent in Agrippa. And it wasn't inherent in Crowley, but that's because, he thought he was the prophet of a new eon. But right there is this kind of idea of how getting access to the past in a correct way, or in an improved or higher fidelity way, should be a component in how you reorder and reposition the priorities in your own life, how you engage with other people, and looking forward further into Fort's dominant of witchcraft. And for me, I guess, why I want that, I've spoken about trophic cascades and what getting an adequate mixture of kind of accurate magic and a politics that isn't disastrous or limiting or cruel. Getting those things right is part of that trophic cascade where you will be, returning to the analog network idea, you will be a node in this analog network of people who have a profound understanding that when you die, it isn't the end, that psi phenomena are real. Everyone on Earth, regardless of cultural background, has as their birthright access to varying degrees to the mythology and wisdom of the whole world, and this stuff people don't realize they don't need or don't have the framework for, and it's you don't need to stand on a street corner to do it. It will just happen. You will be in a position where you can have a positive impact in someone's life if you are doing and thinking magic in a good way. And so now I'm in San Diego for the alchemical wedding of Greg Carlwood, and I met some of his Missourian friends the other night, and one of them had I mentioned on the podcast before and on the blog that as I was a child I had sleep paralysis, hag attack episodes, and this guy, he still has them, or he hasn't had one in the last 18 months, but he's obviously adult age now, and he still has them. They're different. They weren't the classic hag attacks, but they were closer to the same general idea that it's unbelievably terrifying and it comes with paralysis, and the whole point of it appears to be to cause you terror. So his would manifest as almost a classic alien encounter, and sometimes as home invaders, and either way it would be the same. You kind of half stir, and it waits in the corner of the room until you become aware of it, and then it sort of whooshes up, and you have this unbelievable terror experience. And so we're just sitting around talking and drinking. He had no idea he was going to meet someone who could have the discussion around the science, which is although the model is crude, there's something to it, which is that different parts of the brain waking up at different times means that, like, the front of your brain, which would control your kind of conscious use of the body, isn't yet awake, but the back of your brain, where your sort of fear centers and so on is awake, and that's clearly associated with it. So we got to talk about that, but he was also surprised at the commonality of the experience, because I happen to know it's, one, as an experiencer, but I happen to know it's reasonably well researched, so I could point him in certain directions. And that was just, it seemed a really nice culmination to me of what I've been talking about in this Talking About Talking episode, which is how that once the practice and thinking of magic is situated in your life, there are moments like that make you realize that whilst he will never go off and be a magician, that's not the point. I was the trophic cascade that I was able to re-enchant that corner of his life, and we will he'll go back to Missouri or wherever, and I'll go back to Australia, and I think that's what the analog network is for, rather than having people accumulate on a particular platform and argue. I think it has to go back. I think the general re-enchantment of the West needs to happen in that non-linear, permanently unpredictable mode, and realizing that it does kind of change the way you approach magic and how you approach talking about it, and don't proselytize a particular system, and all these sort of best practice, all this sort of best practice tumbles out of thinking in that way. And so yes, it's been an interesting week and a half so far, and it's been really, really encouraging to see that, particularly when you now, as I do, live in a town of 1,800 people in the foothills of mountains in the great southern land, that there are actually, it sounds silly, you're all real and doing things. And I hope, even if you couldn't make the event, I hope this podcast serves to reinforce that notion that there are real people out there. There are people trophically cascading and exploring these ideas, and they're not, and it's not as solitary as a solitary pursuit as it might sometimes feel. So those are my thoughts. Rather than talking about talking, I rambled about discourse, I guess, and its benefit, and what its benefit looks like to me, and certainly what I get out of it, which is over the last week and a half has really been brought home. So thank you to everyone who showed up. And thank you to everyone who told others about it and well wished and so on. It was a real eye opener, and we'll have to do it again soon.